Just got a
I
notification that Declan is live.
yeah, I tacked on, on the reading schedule this one parable. I think just because I was trying to even out the number of pages, but given that the last reading is not that long, I suggest we just ignore it unless we run out of things to talk about, and just talk about the Inferno next time, and because it's only one page. And it's kind of weird that it's just this one page thing at the end of this. But I mean, if somebody really desperately wants to, I'm happy with that. But
yeah, I forgot to even read that.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually pretty.
I mean, I guess I could right now.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. But given this essay on time there's a lot going on here. So I is typical Borges humor on the first page after the italics, after the little intro section. He says, I have glimpsed or foreseen a refutation of time in which I myself do not believe, but which regularly visits me at night in the weary twilight with the illusory force of an axiom. Anyway, I just thought that was kind of hilarious. I don't actually believe this, and then he's going to spend like 20 pages defending this thesis. I guess.
Which of us haven't done that?
What's that?
Which of us haven't done that? Spend 20 pages defending a thesis we don't actually buy.
Yeah, well, I'm guessing the sense is, a lot of these things, which is I think one of the things that Bergson is pointing out. Philosophers come up with these things, and you just go, that can't be right. I can't believe that. But then you can defend it. On the other hand, there have been a lot of crazy things that people couldn't believe that turned out to be true. So that's when some people, use as as sort of a common sense defense on something. I say, sometimes I say, well, common sense is often common foolishness, because things that sound ridiculous sometimes actually turn out to be true. So I thought actually that I'm wondering how Borges would respond to this essay. That was one question I had. And then it seems now this is, I guess I'm posing as what I got, sort of the basic idea I got from this essay. The basic two claims, I think, are on page 223 in this edition, which is, I don't know, it's like 4 or 5 pages in. And at the bottom of the top paragraph, he says, in other words, there is no such history. He's referring to what he's just talked about. Each moment we live in exists, but not their imaginary combination. And then after he talks about Shakespeare, he says, I add, if time is a mental process, how can thousands of men or even two different men share it? So it seemed to me there were two basic ideas here. One, that at first I thought he was just saying that time is purely subjective, and that, we each experience our own temporal sense, and that there is no universal time frame. But then he also seems to be, as that first quotation suggests, it seems to me what he's saying is that all that really exists is this sort of infinitesimal moment, and that any other, because he keeps talking about how succession is not a real thing. So anyway, that was what it seemed to me were his two main points. But I'm willing to admit that I may have misinterpreted them, or there may be more. So feel free to go.
Yeah, I had a hard time understanding exactly what he was claiming here too, in the sense that he seems to have a argument for presentism, that only the present exist. But then he also seems to have this kind of argument where he's using Hume's ideas about causality or whatnot, and instead he's applying them, instead of to the self, he's applying them to succession and time. And I'm not sure if those two are the same argument or if they're supposed to support each other or what. I don't know. It was kind of incomprehensible to me exactly what he was arguing about. Like, there seems to be multiple claims going on. He's kind of like giving a variety of different ones that are each the commonalities that they're arguing against, this successive time, but there doesn't seem to be much internal coherence between them. And then even his the thing at the end where he talks about this experience of, I guess he's having like the same memory or the same experience twice or something like that. So that also was kind of confusing in the sense of exactly how it aligned with what he was saying previously. So yeah, there's a lot of confusion here, but yeah, hopefully someone can help me understand this, because I don't know, it seems kind of like what he says at the very beginning. It seems kind of an anachronistic reductio ad absurdum of a preterite system. Yeah, I think that's kind of what's going on. Like, he basically gives his own critique there. He doesn't even believe it himself. And indeed, like the philosophers that he's citing, Berkeley, Hume, like, not many people actually believed what they said, even if their arguments were decent. Is, yeah, common sense or whatnot.
I think as far as Hume goes, some people still accept the soundness of some of Hume's critiques, in the sense that we have no direct connection to a physical world, if there is such. And so I think some of the distrust of metaphysics in the early 20th century is actually connected to Hume's worries about the fact that all we have access to are our perceptions. And so, Bergson reads Hume as an idealist like Berkeley, but I was a little surprised by that, and I went and I just looked at the Stanford Encyclopedia and the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and they both agreed that contemporary Hume scholars are not that clear on whether Hume was an idealist or not, because sometimes he talked as if he was, and sometimes he talked as if he wasn't. What they seem to agree on is that he's a metaphysical skeptic. So that, the way I would put it is, if there is a material world, we can't know it directly. All we know are our, one way I put it is, we live in a model, or the way some, like there's a TED talk where some guy says how the brain hallucinates reality. And so that we live in this mental model. And so then what science is about is testing the model against experimental results and tuning the model. But the model is never the reality, and it never can be. And so some people read Hume more like that, like you can't, that it's a mistake to do metaphysics in the sense of thinking you're really, really talking about reality. You're just talking about your model of reality. I don't know why I said all that. I guess that was like, just because, like saying that, that Hume, people don't really believe Hume, but philosophers of science, many philosophers of science would accept his basic skepticism about not all of them. There are realist philosophers of science, but there are so-called anti-realists who pretty much accept his skepticism about our ability to make substantive, no pun intended, metaphysical claims.
Yeah, I think So he denied that there's a material kind of substratum that we could know underneath sensory impressions or whatnot. So I think in that sense, he was, although he didn't necessarily say there was some kind of a spiritual or, mental construct underlying sense impressions either. He seemed to just kind of leave them floating of their own accord in a sense, and said we can't really know, what the metaphysical basis of these sensory impressions are, because that's all we know is these, these simultaneous instant sensory impressions that hit us, and then all the ways we combine them are human convention and habit and whatnot. But I think the thing, okay, so the reason I say that about Hume, though, is mainly about the idea that we can't really have any kind of basis of knowledge for what you could call causality. That's where I think nobody can really actually have that as a way of living, of orienting yourself to the world. Basically, we kind of have to, whatever like your actual metaphysical position on causality is, basically as living in the world, the way that we engage with it, there's some aspect of causality that we deal with just naturally. And that's where I see a disjunct there. And as far as Berkeley, I see the thing that I would say that there's a position that no one actually really holds necessarily, although it's kind of complex, because he said, okay, well, basically it's the idea that when there's nobody perceiving something, it doesn't exist, which, most naturally your natural position towards the world still exists. But then he said that God is the observer that observes things when, some conscious human person is not. But either way, so I didn't mean to make a big point about that, but just wanted to clarify that. I guess that's why I think, because when it really comes down to it, I think is a lot of the ways that people try to refute time, the conclusions aren't really acceptable in terms of some way that you can actually utilize it and live your life in some kind of way. It offers no real wisdom for trying to approach life. There's no actual philosophia there going on. It's just kind of a purely logical thing where it's, oh yeah, no time, okay. And then they continue to act as if, time of course is real in some sense. So that's where I find arguments like this, they're just kind of like, oh, they're just kind of exhausting. I'm just like, oh yeah, sure, right, okay. I'd rather have something that actually kind of allows me to understand the things that I actually deal with, including time, instead of just be like, yeah, it's not real, dude. Yeah. So that's my gripe against this, I guess.
I think I think I understand what you're saying. Like, I hate to bring him up again, but reading this felt like watching like a really avant-garde film by David Lynch or something. It was like it felt almost like you have like a philosophical argument, right? And they're usually structured in a certain way with a cohesive sort of line of reasoning or argumentation, a series of ideas that make sense or have time to be fleshed out or whatever. And it's like that is like a beautiful flower, or a beautiful flower garden of ideas. And this felt sort of like you go to Hobby Lobby and you get those plastic bouquets of bullshit that smell like scented cinnamon pine cones or whatever the fuck. Just it was this weird condensed kind of nonsensical, kind of surreal. Like it's like the feeling of reading a philosophical argument. It was like it had all the right beats of a traditional philosophical argument, but it was like a poem. It was like a poem written purely in prose and in the style of a philosophical argument. You know what I'm saying? And I really got a sense of that when he's, after having all of these kind of outlandish, these certain outlandish, outlandishly long explorations of these metaphors or experiences that he's had of these evenings or these dreams or whatever. At the very end, saying, and yet, denying temporal succession, denying the self, the astronomical universe, or apparent desperations, secret constellations, or consolations, or destiny. And he's talking about like destiny, that as opposed to the hell of Swedenborg and the hell of Tibetan mythology. It's not frightful by being unreal. It is frightful because it's irreversible and ironclad. And he says, time is the substance I am made of. Time is a river which sweeps me along, but I am the river. It's very poetic to me. I don't know. It just feels very like. And then he brings up the tiger and the fire, which we read about in the circular ruin thing. The world, unfortunately, is real. I, unfortunately, am Borges. And he's doing, and it's like he said at the beginning, like a lot of the things he's saying are going to beg the question. And there are going to be a lot of instances, like in that paragraph, where he's using these temporal markers for ideas and for these metaphors, while trying to deny the existence of temporality or time in this sort of Leibnizian way. But it just seems like poetry. It just seems like this wild, ride that you're being taken on, I guess. But I don't know.
I don't know if in all of yours version of it, but in mine, this essay, hesitate to call it a short story. You know how they have the prologue and then the letter A? He has the letter A, capital letter A, and then it's right after the number 2. Do you have it arranged the same way I just described?
Yeah, it is in my version.
Okay. Well, look at the sentence that is the beginning of the number 2. All language is of a successive nature. It does not lend itself to a reasoning of the internal, the intemporal. And, he loves to play around with language. At the same time, he seems to recognize a certain limitation to language. And if language has these limits, you can imagine how it would be difficult to have a philosophy or a understanding of time if the language itself has some major issues.
Yeah, in that respect, it kind of reminded me of like the Parmenidean. Is that how you Parmenides? Right, this sort of conception. Okay, so we're gonna say maybe time doesn't exist, right? Everything's just sort of a block. Conceptualized time is just like another spatial dimension. Well, Borges doesn't seem to want to do that specifically. I thought my brain could kind of like I felt like I got the argument, but it might just be because I was sort of picking up on the, like y'all were talking about sort of the narrative character of what he was doing. And since it looked like a philosophical argument to me, my brain just started like tying together all of the ideas into something. It did seem to me like he was bumping up against this problem that our language seems to be very temporal. Our descriptions of things seems to be very temporal. Do you run exactly into the same problems when you start trying to like get rid of the conception of the self, right? In terms of the example he was using, right? Or when we start talking about like Buddhist conceptions of self, self non-existence effectively. It's like, well, I just constantly refer to myself as I constantly conceive of people as selves. Some of that just seems to be an aspect of like how our language is designed. And so it's just difficult to convey ideas to people without making those types of references. So I would definitely say that like since this is Borges, right? I mean, this might be this might be a joke, right? Like this might be like an attempt to kind of like poke fun at philosophers and the way they kind of conceptualize things. But I mean, I want to take this seriously, this idea that like, yeah, I mean, he's writing an essay where he's trying to explain what an alternative, like, I can deny time, I can deny it for these reasons, but it might just be difficult for me to speak consistently in this way that I've never done throughout my entire life, in a way that I don't even necessarily believe in, since he doesn't necessarily buy the argument. But he may need to use language that theoretically violates the rules that he's setting forth in order to describe those rules. Like I think that makes sense. The other thing, I mean, I think that this succession, particularly when we're talking about Hume, because it makes sense to me that like Hume, I know a lot of like very materialisty, sciencey type people, right, going along with the sort of philosophy of science angle, who just really love Hume and think he's great, and a lot of them are hardcore materialists. I mean, he's mentioning Schopenhauer, saying that everything, kind of breaking the hypothetical rules that would be set up by this, and talking about things going on in the brain. And every time you encounter someone like, I don't know, Stephen Hawking or Richard Dawkins or something like that, they might kind of like play at being big time Humeans, but then you find out that they really have like very little skepticism for the scientific material that they kind of just buy. What they have is a lot of skepticism, kind of metaphysical jumbo that they've identified as bad. So I think that this is like a consistent sort of problem with reading Hume well, and it might also be that Hume is just a little bit contradictory in this respect. But I think it makes sense to say, look, for the same reasons that Berkeley might be skeptical of the material world in terms of a materialist substance metaphysics, we might have equally good reasons to be suspicious of a spiritual substance, and right in terms of like the existence of like selves that can contact with each other, because Berkeley is dependent on this idea that not only is there me, but there's also this God, and this God is playing an important metaphysical role in the way things are operating, and we just sort of doubt that. We just say, well, maybe that God isn't there. Well, right, what we have to sort of conclude is that a lot of the things that we want to attribute to those substances are essentially accidents, right? Like the apparent continuity of my conception of myself isn't demonstrative of a self, it's demonstrative of, oh, well, there are these things that are playing out in this way that kind of looks like what we've decided to describe as a self. And to a certain extent, like I think something like Kant might say, or that a phenomenologist might say, is, well, or something I might say, I'll put that out there, is like, well, what do we mean by the word self other than just this thing I'm observing that seems to be tying all of this stuff together? What do we mean by matter other than, well, like sometimes I like slap something and and there's something there. It seems like there's something there at the very least. Like this kind of seems to do an interesting sort of reversal where there was a lot of theoretical hypothesizing about what matter is, and then we assumed that theoretical hypothesizing was primary and our experiences were secondary. And so then, well, a skeptic can come along and say, well, how do we know any of this theorization is true? But then since we've identified the concept of stuff with that theorization, when we can doubt that theorization, then we can doubt the existence of the stuff. And so I think that the Borges move that he's making makes sense in that respect. If we think we have a concrete idea of what time is, like it's a succession of moments that are tied together by some kind of metaphysical property, or even if it's even if I think we're Einsteinian about this, and we're like, maybe it's like sort of perspectivistically relative, but it's still this sort of like flow of things. Well, if we have a concrete theory and we say, well, that theory is equal to this concept of time, and then if we have any kind of reason to doubt that theory, which I think is what Borges is mentioning, he's mentioning some reasons to doubt those theoretical accounts. Like, is there a definite through line between any of these experiences? Why is it that when right? You know, so he mentions Leibniz at the beginning, and then he doesn't talk about him at all. But he does mention this idea when he's talking about the dreamer, right? When he's talking about, I forget the Chinese philosopher who's, you know, dreamed that he was a butterfly. Well, what if somebody else had exactly the same dream? Well, if they had exactly the same dream, aren't they the same object? Haven't they encountered the same thing? But how could they encounter the same thing if time exists, right? Surely they would have to be sort of two different instances. So either they had two different dreams, or somehow this dream is able to be connected to two different moments in our descriptive thing that we think of as time. So I think that maybe what Borges is pointing to here is like, or this is my best attempt to like read this as a legit philosophical argument that believes in its conclusions and is trying to like, the identity of indiscernibles, right? That they have to be identical. And right, if there are some like one random like physics theory that I'm aware of is that there actually is only one electron in the entire universe, but it's just because time doesn't really matter on the quantum level, it can just be in all of these different places at once. But it's one electron. So I think that you could read this as a reductio, and I think that might lead you to some interesting conclusions. But if we want to try and buy the argument that he's made here, I think the argument is just essentially, look, if we can doubt the metaphysics of the existence of material, and we can doubt the metaphysics of the existence of spirit, then why couldn't we doubt this like metaphysical existence of time? Yeah, there's a bunch of things that look like time that we still have to account for. But then again, there's a bunch of stuff that looks like myself that I need to account for, and a bunch of stuff that looks like shit that that I need to account for in any sort of model that I would propose. But he's not proposing that alternative model. He's just putting doubt on our prayer. Right. So I ranted long enough. So I hope that was.
Can I mention one thing? I thought I really enjoyed what you said. I thought you were going in a different direction, kind of like in the beginning, but that's okay. If you look at the paragraph before the footnote to the prologue, so it's the second to the last paragraph. I mean, this is where Borges seems to carry the dialectic within himself. So he's going to present a thesis and an antithesis. But if you look at that last paragraph before the prologue, the footnote to the prologue, he says, the second sentence, our destiny, ignore the parentheses, our destiny is not frightful by being unreal. It is frightful because it is irreversible and ironclad. And it seems to me that the implication there is we can talk about all the time that, begging your pardon for saying all the time, we can talk often about the unreality or the non-existence of time, but hello, we're all going to die. So that seems to be an irrefutable empirical proof that they're right, irreversible, ironclad. There's going to be death, which happens over the course of someone being alive and then they're dead. And there's some kind of temporal sequence there, and so that's where I see him almost contradicting his earlier position in the essay.
I think even to like lend credence to that last line of that paragraph is, you know, the world unfortunately is real. I unfortunately am Borges. And I think that's something that's very telling as to kind of his stance about all of this. At least I feel like a lot of it is really going to be some kind of satirical approach, or at least commentary on philosophical dialectics of like metaphysics, only because like Chase was kind of saying, it seems to be a little nonsensical or a little all over the place when it comes to formulating, or at least trying to frame some kind of reference to developing argumentation for this theory that he may or may not believe or does not believe. So I don't know, I was just reading it, I was a little confused, to be honest, just because I couldn't get a clear idea other than the fact that we don't have access to it. And I feel like that the parable reading is something that to me made more sense when you look at it in reference to this reading, only because the whole idea of us not being able to access the machinery of what time actually is or what the world actually is because we are human and because we have subjective perception or experience or consciousness or whatever, however we can use language or symbolism or self-referencing to try to communicate what we feel or perceive as time.
I'd like to give some reasons why I might take this seriously, rather than as just satire or something like that. So, like with regard to, for example, Hume's theory of causation, I think it actually does have real world implications. Specifically, the distinction between causation and correlation. And so I think Hume's fundamental insight is not that there are no causal forces in the world, it's that we don't have access to the causal forces in the world. All we have access to are our perceptions. And so all we're stuck with is basically correlation. And so his deconstruction of causation, again, I think is still largely accepted by scientists. Granted, it's not something that any of us, including Hume, worries about on a daily basis, although, it bites us in the ass every now and then, when you assume you've seen something happen all the time, and then you go and make a decision based on that, and it turns out it didn't happen this time because there was not really a causal thing going on there. So I think Hume's deconstruction of causation does have a real impact, specifically in science, and then also in, for example, I think his analysis of causation is one explanation for why we are so superstitious, because, like these used to be email and now Facebook messages about, you better do this because if you don't, something terrible is going to happen to you. Well, that may have the reason that sort of thing sometimes shows up is because somebody did some ritual over and over and over, and all these great things happened to them. They didn't do the ritual and something terrible happened. And so we're sort of pre-programmed into thinking that correlation is causation. And Hume gives us a reason to doubt that on pretty rigorous philosophical grounds. We don't, if there is a real substantial world that has real causal forces, great, but we don't have access to it. All we have access to is what shows up in our minds. And so you need to be careful. And so, so Borges worries about time may function on a similar sort of ground. Be careful about making sort of superficial, glib, metaphysical commitments about time, because it may not be what we think it is. And then with regard to his general, I think so that I agree that it's kind of fractured and spread out, but the sort of general frame of his argument, I think, is like this. Idealism is difficult to refute dogmatically. So, Hume seems, and I think phenomenology is an effort to overcome this problem. But if you just look at Hume's basic insight, all I have access to are my mental perceptions. That seems clear. Again, phenomenology tries to undercut this worry, but that seems clear. All I have access are my perceptions. And then, Hume is not going to accept the existence of a God to tie all these things together. And so if you throw out, a divine mind, then you have the worry, is there any material world beyond these perceptions? And I think Berkeley would say no. I think Hume would say maybe, but I don't know, because we have no access to it. And then, so Berkeley denies the existence of the material world as an idealist. Hume denies the existence of a permanent self on similar epistemological grounds. Namely, the same Buddhist insight, you have zero experience of a permanent self. You may have an existence of a flow of perceptions, but you have zero. I'm with him on that. You know, when I interrogate my mental world, I don't find any permanent perception, any permanent, you know, any experience of anything permanent. As Hume says, and as the Buddhists would say, it's just a constant flow of perceptions. There's nothing constant there. And so as an empiricist, Hume's going to say, well, if you don't have an experience of it, then you shouldn't posit it as a metaphysical reality. And that's exactly the insight that Kant accepted and forced him to assert the existence of a transcendental ego. Because, you know, Kant's response to Hume is, okay, granted, there's just this flow of perceptions, but they have this really well-structured, organized form. And if there was no organizing entity behind the scenes, I would not have a well-structured flow of perceptions. It would just be shit happening. And so, since it's not like that, there must be something behind the scenes. So, granted, my empirical ego, the one that I have access to in my mind, is not constant. It's just shifting, changing, moving all the time. And so there is no permanent empirical self, but he says there must be an empirical transcendental self behind the scenes. But if you're going to be a thorough empiricist like, you know, like Hume, if you want to be rigorous about it, saying that there is a world outside my mental perceptions is speculation. Saying that there is a permanent self behind my perceptions is speculation. And so then all you have are a flow of perceptions, and that's it. And Borges is explicit about that. I'm not going to try to find the passage, but where that's just all, if that's just all there is. If that's all there is, then you have no stable reference against which to measure the passage of time. And so if there is no stable material world to measure it, and if there is no internal permanent reference, if you have nothing stable to measure the passage of time, then the passage of time is equally a metaphysical speculation. And this was exactly, you know, Kant, sort of ironically, he called himself a transcendental idealist, but he called himself an empirical realist. I mean, that's what Kant himself said. And in the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, he included a thing called the Refutation of Idealism. And what his Refutation of Idealism said, there must be an empirical world for exactly this reason, because I do experience the passage of time, but that internal passage of time is experienced with reference to a stable external world. And so there must be an external, and he's not talking about the noumena here. He's talking about the world of external phenomena as opposed to the world of purely internal mental phenomena. So it's still phenomena. He's not referring to the noumena. But he says that in order to have an experience of time, you've got to have a stable reference against which to measure it. And for Kant, that's the so-called empirical world. And so that was sort of the essence of his refutation of idealism. But it sounds to me like, and I don't know why Hume didn't, or why Borges didn't bring that up, but it seems like if you say, you know, that if you accept the basic premise of Hume, that all we have are perceptions, and you accept the empiricist thesis that we have no experience of the underlying so-called metaphysical substrate of that world, and I don't have any empirical experience of the metaphysical substrate of myself, then all there is are these flow of perceptions. There is nothing against which to measure time. And so all I have experience of is this moment augmented by my memory of the past, which is a memory, which is, I think, why Borges says the past doesn't exist. You know, I may have a memory of it, but it doesn't exist. And I may have an imaginative anticipation of the future, but that's imagination. And that's not real either. You know, so Borges is saying the past is not real. It doesn't exist now. The future does not exist now. I have I have no metaphysical permanence in my experience. Therefore, my experience of time is this sort of, and he doesn't say this, but kind of my thinking is then that my experience of time is this infinitesimal moment augmented by this memory of the immediate past and my anticipation of the immediate future. But I'm thinking some phenomenologists would say those actually are real, that immediate past and that immediate future. But I think Borges would say, no, they're not. And so it seems to me he's just, I think, his stories show us, I think, that he is very captivated by idealism. And maybe he's captivated by idealism because of, the force of Hume's and Berkeley's observation that all we have are access to our perceptions. And so then but then if you accept idealism and you become more rigorous about it than Berkeley and Hume, then you end up with the possibility that time doesn't exist. And if you say, well, that's just ridiculous, well, again, maybe it's ridiculous because I'm not sure I have free will, frankly, metaphysical free will. It feels like I do, but I've got good metaphysical reasons to doubt that. Just because I have this experience that seems to confirm it does not prove that there's a metaphysical ground for it. And so then if you begin to think, well, why would you even care about that? Well, there's reasons to care about Hume's problems with causation. Maybe there's reasons to worry about, at least philosophical reasons, to worry about this time problem. So as Sean has already brought up, if you have multiple moments that are identical, using Leibniz's notion, how can you say that they're different? And if there is no metaphysical subject that's independent, that mine is independent from yours, you start wondering, maybe there's only one metaphysical subject. And so then I think one reason he's attracted to Schopenhauer is because Schopenhauer suggests that there's the metaphysical ground is sort of this timeless, and I don't know how a will strives without time, but this timeless striving of the will, and that this individuation is illusory. The individual self, the individual soul, all that's illusory. And then time is in some sense I don't know Schopenhauer well, but it's like this sort of manufactured illusion that the will generates. And so I think, there's interesting metaphysical implications of taking this argument seriously. And given the way he's brought in, these different points, I actually think he's thinking that this is worth taking seriously. And when he says, I don't believe it, maybe what he means is kind of like, I can't really believe I don't have free will because I sure feel like I can pick up that glass and either drink it or dump it. But there's reasons, metaphysical reasons, to think that feeling of freedom may actually be illusory, even if it seems obvious to me that I do have free will.
Yeah, that was very helpful. That made way more sense than the actual essay itself, I think. So I guess what he's saying is he's really questioning that there's some kind of a stable referent on which we can judge an objective succession of time. And it's really more so the kind of objective clock time that he's putting into doubt, which I can definitely sympathize with that. And I think he has a point there in saying that, we have these different moments of experience, exactly how we connect them in some kind of a completely objective way, that's always going to be somewhat suspect. I can definitely agree with that. I think really the problem I would have with it is I keep thinking of time in terms of basically Bergson's duration. And it's kind of like, okay, all these things that he's talking about, just by having two different experiences or something like that, that's already, you couldn't have just one single moment without having some kind of a a temporal flow within that in order to even just think of something or to have any kind of experience at all. You have to have some kind of temporal quality to it that may be illusory, but even if it's illusory, it's kind of like experience itself in that, well, okay, but you're still having some kind of temporal something going on. So I think that's the part where I would say that can't be doubted, but I think trying to say that, you know, if we just take time as being, you know, clock time, objective time, I think between those levels of a kind of interior, I guess for lack of a better term, some kind of inner duration that we experience and is indeed a condition, a precondition of any kind of experience at all. And between that and this objective time, there's definitely an epistemological gap there. And I think that if that's what he's getting at, then I can definitely make much more sense of that. And also, yeah, the Changzu's butterfly dream, I think that's a good example of something where, yeah, you've got two different experiences with their own kind of temporal flows to them that it wouldn't make any sense necessarily in a totally objective temporal sense. So what he's getting at there is that there's kind of a multiplicity of these subjective temporal senses that are not totally in line with an objective sense of it. So that I can understand, but see, the thing would be if you'd say that there's no temporal sense at all to any of those experiences, that's what I would say doesn't make any sense. But I think basically if what he's claiming there is more in line with the other point of view, then I can definitely go along with that. And then I still think, though I think it's important, as a lot of you pointed out, that, you know, this is framed within him saying basically, you know, that it's, I definitely don't think he's saying, you know, don't take this seriously at all, or take it super seriously. He's definitely presenting it as, because he's basically just giving a kind of a skeptical argument, and he's not giving some kind of dogmatic assertion of something. So I think that's why he presents it as something kind of lighthearted, and also because he's saying, yeah, but still ultimately I'm Borges, you know, there's still this level of I'm Borges and, you know, I'm going to die. So there's some kind of temporal sense also in that. I just think it's basically between the levels of these different senses of time. That's where he's kind of playing with these gaps in our knowledge between these different levels. So I don't know. It makes a lot more sense now that I've heard what everyone said.
I first of all, I agree with the Bergson thing. I think it's strange that he kind of recognizes that he made these essays after Bergson, which makes it seem like he would know Bergson's argument, but also he's not really like talking a whole lot about Bergson. And I feel like that's my immediate inclination to say that, oh, well, you know, all these moments of you remembering the same thing along this walk, those are different because everyone has all of the memories of you remembering it beforehand, you know, that are coloring this memory, and it's becoming a more repetitive thing. It's becoming something that you're used to and comfortable with, while at the beginning maybe it wasn't, you know. So I can see those two things as different things, or as different memories, different moments of time because of that. The other thing is that I think I think that Borges' tone is always like a little skeptical of himself. I think that he's just kind of constantly questioning himself, and it goes with this argument that he makes in some of the short stories and essays, is that he can't control how seriously people take him, I think. And so he recognizes that and knows that over time, people will either think this is just some silly ramblings, or they'll think it's an actual refutation of time, So I think that he recognizes the fact that he has very little control on whether someone takes this seriously or not. And him saying, "Hey, please take this seriously," kind of, I think in his head doesn't make a difference. So him like recognizing that early on and just kind of being like, "Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether or not I really truly believe this or not, but it's an idea and it should be, I have an itch to express it. I have a desire to express it. So its value is that."
Yeah, I kind of with Chase that I think that, taking Borges seriously in this essay doesn't mean that he's dogmatically asserting, and in fact, many of you, or you guys, several of you have pointed out reasons to doubt that, that he's not dogmatically asserting, because he's like, well, I don't really believe this, and he's like, well, I'm going to die, and but I think so. Kind of in light of Bergson, I think that Borges didn't. I don't know how much he read Bergson, but I'm guessing he didn't read him in depth. That's just, I'm guessing, just because of what he says about Bergson. He doesn't say a lot, and so I'm wondering if maybe this is exactly the kind of puzzle. It's a legitimate puzzle, but I think it's probably, like Chase said, it's probably the kind of puzzle that Bergson would point to and say, well, the reason it's a puzzle is exactly because you're analyzing this temporal flow, this duration, in terms of the deconstructive intellect that has to break things down into points, and that's not the way time really is. So I suspect that that Bergson would go, well, Borges, you've done a really great job of pointing out why that kind of analysis falls short. So it seems like Borges ends in this kind of perplexity, and Bergson's like, good job. Now here's what I say about that. And I have a hard time, frankly, I still have a hard time exactly knowing what Bergson means by duration, but the idea that, my vague notion that it is the constant emergence of the new that then becomes time in some way, or becomes change. Maybe you shouldn't even say time. Maybe time is the intellectual abstraction of this constant movement of change, and this constant development that's happening, that according to Bergson's view, if you take that seriously, then it eliminates a lot of these problems. I was trying to read a little bit ahead for Friday's seminar, and in the next reading, Bergson starts talking about, when the arrow flies, it's not going through an infinite number of points. It's just flying through an arc, and then you can look at it, and using your intellect, you can go, well, no, there's an infinite number of points. And like he says, well, Zeno would say that it had to be at this point. It is at this point, then it is at this point, then it is at this point, then it is at this point. And Bergson's like, no, it's not is. It doesn't exist at a point. It exists through the arc. And so I'm thinking that maybe Bergson would say that Borges's analysis suffers from a similar kind of problem.
Nevitt, I thought your analysis was masterful in bringing up Hume and Kant and bringing it to Borges, and I think that the main argument that he was making, you summed up extraordinarily well. I at the same time, I think that at the very end of the essay is Borges saying, that he really brought up all these issues with time, suggesting that it isn't really real. But then at the very end, it's almost like he's saying, but how can it not be real if we all die? You know what I'm trying to say? I mean, it's just the intellectual artifact, not artifact, but the intellectual edifice is interesting, and you were able to bring out the skeleton of it, right? The actual how he was making the argument. But it's almost like he's saying, yeah, I explained all this intellectually, and I'm still stuck with, yeah, I'm gonna die. And so how you know, and it seems to me he's not able to make that great synthesis of this doubting that time as we understand it exists, and yet the temporal, begging your pardon for saying reality, temporal course effect of death. How are those two? I don't see him reconciling it, but I see him bringing up both sides of it.
One thing that I think kind of related to that, because he's mentioning not only like Western philosophers, but kind of these Eastern conceptions. And it does seem as though there is a kind of impotence in philosophy insofar as it maybe denies certain things existence or denies the like meaningfulness of certain things in ways that can't really have an effect, or can't really produce a result, right? Like I can deny time as much as I want, but some aspect of what we're describing as time is still going to affect me. So I definitely I would agree with that, and I think it's a thing worth mentioning about. I mean, I think part of what ultimately pushed me away from I don't know, embracing some version of Buddhism is precisely my like a kind of like, sure, it's all of the arguments for why this makes sense seem to work, but it just doesn't intuit. It doesn't solve any of my fundamental anxieties about the world. It kind of just tells me that I shouldn't care about them. And I mean, I feel like you know, a really committed Humean, or a really committed, I don't know, what do we want to describe a person who's sort of embracing this theoretical position that Borges is presenting to us? I mean, part of what I was thinking about it with him going to the graveyard, right, and or walking by it multiple times, and that eliciting sort of the same sensation from him, is a kind of moment where yes, there's this compounding factor that Bergson might talk about in terms of like, oh, well, I have the memory of the prior experiences and those affect my kind of emotional reaction to it. But there is a certain kind of like subjective uncertainty about that relationship, right? Like even though my memory of a prior experience can affect my current experience of something, the way that it does that isn't so obvious and so direct that it clearly indicates to something that I would describe as time. It seems to be a more subjective, fiddly, like the fact that I've processed this emotion before brings up some new ideas and brings up a sort of an awareness of this fact. So I'm thinking about that with respect to like an event like death, right? I mean, something that an Epicurean might say about it is just like, you can't experience death because, well, once you're dead, there's nothing there to experience. You know, what we're sort of pointing to at death is, well, if we assume this thing called time exists, then it's sort of the termination of this row of interconnected experiences. And if there's a termination of a row of interconnected experiences in the model that we're talking about, well, it's unclear what would that even mean. Like, there's a kind of subjective interconnectivity of experiences, but I think to start talking about it, we almost have to go to like Heidegger and start talking about anxiety and start thinking about projects and the kind of end of those projects and like the inability to fulfill them, or the inability to continue them into the future. And in that sense, like, death starts playing a really weird role in the way that we temporally set up a specific sort of framework. So while I think Borges is right to point to death as something that should cast doubt on what kind of power we think this temporal analysis has given us can really do. It can't really solve our anxieties of death or prevent it from happening or something like that. I do think that it might lead us to some alternative ways of thinking about death, what it means for us as experiencing things, many of which would be ways that I wouldn't agree with. Like, I don't think that the Epicurean way of handling it and conceiving of it is very healthy or good, but it's philosophically consistent, just like all of these other things that we've sort of been talking about.
I'm reminded, at least I've heard that Wittgenstein said this, that life is endless because you don't experience your coming into life, because you just show up, and then you don't experience your death either, because death is exactly the end of experience. And so I wonder, it seems like one of the issues that Chase and Sean seem to point to is, it's kind of like, what difference does this make? And as like myself, a philosopher, I find it interesting just to think about. It's fun to think about, but is it more than just an intellectual game? And I think, I'm wondering if that's one reason why, or I don't even know if he planned it this way, but one reason why Borges interleaves experiences in his life with these sort of abstract theoretical arguments, because he, some people have called him an existentialist writer, and in the sense that he's deeply concerned with the way this affects human life. And so maybe what we see in this essay is an effort to link those two up, or maybe to look at sort of a theoretical aspect and then more of an existential aspect. And maybe he doesn't really point to it. But maybe he's proposing that, if you think about time in this different way, maybe it does have some sort of existential, what's the word I want to use? Gives us some kind of relief, maybe, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, he doesn't, it's not obvious, because he just says, well, heck, I'm still going to die. I mean, that doesn't sound like a great deal of relief, but the notion of if the metaphysical substrate, the metaphysical whatever is some, maybe it's not Schopenhauer's thing, but if it is some sort of universality that is prior to any individuation, some people might find that sort of comforting in a way. And as far as, personally, I find Buddhist thought and Buddhist practice to actually be deeply existentially relevant. And one of the reasons is because, Buddhist practice can move you toward ways of experiencing lives in which the force of individuation begins to evaporate to some degree. And since, as Buddhists would say, all suffering is individual suffering, to the degree that my experience as being an individual that's radically separated and blocked off from all other individuals, when that begins to dissolve to some degree, then my sense of personal suffering also begins to soften a bit. And so, these sort of metaphysical speculations, if perhaps meditating on them might actually have some real existential value. And I wonder if that's also part of the reason why you get this shift, maybe not so much with Husserl, but as Sean said, starting with Heidegger and then on into the past him, where you get these existential ramifications of a metaphysical and epistemological theory, and recognizing that the human condition should be taken seriously in a theoretical approach, to a philosophical question. And so maybe Borges is kind of bouncing around, those two issues, theoretically interesting, but then how does this impact the way I experience my life and how I worry about suffering and so on?
Nevit, I wanted to bring up something in it. When you were talking just now, it it prompted me. It was weird to me. I don't know what to make of it, but think of how this essay ends. It's a footnote to the prologue, and and he's talking about, and he brings up Buddhism, and I just structurally that seemed circular, and he seems so precise in the way he does things. Because in one way he could have put the footnote to the prologue immediately after the prologue, right? Because prologue is usually seen to be different enough from the main text, but he puts it at the very end, and the person actually converts to Buddhism, if I'm not mistaken, in that little vignette. And is that another? I don't know what to make of it. So y'all are much more well versed in philosophy than I am. So I didn't know if that was a second and a half take on time, or a third view of time that was a joker in the deck, just in that one short paragraph in the footnote.
I hadn't even noticed that it's a footnote to the prologue, and I was just kind of prologue. I don't know how to connect those two. But what he says specifically, so that I think that's something that would be interesting to explore still. But this paragraph at the end is, I think, a reference. I can't remember the name of the doctrine, but there's one of the Buddhist refutations of the self, of a permanent self, which is very similar to the way Hume goes at it. Is the maybe Chase remembers, but they talk about the 5 skandhas, and I can't remember what they are, but it's basically, if you look at what constitutes what I think of as me, there's like the body and the mind and this and this and this. I can't remember. There's these 5 things. And then they point out that, that they think that is an exhaustive list of all the things that could constitute the self. And then they go through them one right after the other and show that none of them are permanent, but that each one is a shifting, changing flow. And so, this is not a permanent ground of the self. This is not a permanent ground. This is not, this is not, this is not. And so it's very, very reminiscent to the way Hume goes at this, where if you examine what the possible contenders are, in my experience, for being a permanent self, it turns out there just aren't any. And so that I think is referring to that argument. When he says the king's carriage is neither its wheel, nor its body, nor its axle, nor its pole, nor its yoke. Okay, so maybe these are the 5 skandhas here. Neither is man his matter, form, impressions, ideas, instinct, or consciousness. And so if you look at any of those 5, man is not any of those. If you want to think of man as like a Cartesian soul, there is something permanent that exists throughout the entirety of my life. And so I think it's sort of a reference to that deconstruction of the permanent self that you find in Buddhism. But I didn't even notice that it's a footnote to the prologue, and in the prologue he doesn't really talk about Buddhism much, or at all. So I don't know what the connection is.
One random thing that might not have been the connection at all, but it mentions that he's talking to the king of Bactria. I believe the Bactrian king would have been Indo-Greek, which is to say that they would have been culturally Greek, probably also ethnically Greek people who had ended up in Bactria for some complicated historical reasons. This is actually kind of a point of connection between this discussion of Zeno and kind of Buddhist conceptions that we were talking about. I might or might not have been part of his intention there, but
yeah, because wasn't that the part of the Hellenistic world, but like at the eastern edge of it, so to speak, Afghanistan, or what today is Central Asia, south of the Aral Sea, and
yeah. So the area that is today Afghanistan. This is some weird historical stuff, so y'all shut up if you want. So you'll know. So there was the whole deal with the Ionian Greeks, right? And this precipitated the whole Persian invasion of Greece, when you had the Valley of the. So the Ionian Greeks were part of Persian Empire, And when they rebelled, the Persians finally crushed them and reincorporated them into their empire. And what the Persian Empire tended to do with their prisoners from these Greek uprisings was they sent them to Bactria, which is more or less modern day Afghanistan plus some area. It's not like not 1-to-1, but it's about that region. So when Alexander the Great conquered Persia, he found out that there was like a huge number of Greeks just in Bactria already, running around, just existing, basically. And so after his empire, they got a certain degree of like autonomy and control over the region. And there were a succession of kingdoms in that region and also in the northern part, like today, what is Pakistan, basically in the sort of Indus River Valley area. And they were relatively culturally influential. This was about the time that Buddhism was starting to get big in India. So a lot of these interactions, kind of interestingly, are between people who would have had some degree of contact with, Western Greek thought. Right, they would have been aware of like Heraclitus and Plato and like this. They would have been culturally Greek, and they would have been aware of like Greek artistic styles, and those artistic styles influenced like early Buddhist art, and a lot of them converted to Buddhism, and there was some like intellectual interrelation there, basically. And it kind of seems to me like certain aspects of, I would say, like particularly Theravada Buddhist styles of argumentation and kind of the ways that they approach subjects and their kind of enumerated list style, I think makes it, I guess when I found out about this, because I didn't know about it, it made a lot more sense to me in terms of why it feels so similar to what Western arguments look like, as opposed to when I read, say, like, I don't know, like Zen Buddhist or what's the Tibetan version, Vajrayana. Like when you read like stuff from other Buddhist offshoots, it looks a lot less like a Western argument, and it takes a lot of more processing power for my brain to understand what they're trying to argue. Whereas it just feels like whenever I read a Theravadan Buddhist argument, it just flows. Like it's a little bit different from reading like Plato or Socrates. It's similar enough that it makes so much more sense than even like like if I start reading like Hindu doctrines and India, like those right take more processing power for me to understand as well. So maybe he's making a historical reference to this fact. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Certainly, like I think part of the other connection that I think it makes is it helps make sense of why Buddhists and Hume would sort of come to similar conclusions, because they're coming out of similar systems of argumentation. And some of it's just random, but some of it I think is like a degree of that interrelationship, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so the reference he makes is to a early Buddhist kind of parable, I guess. It's a story about a monk who converts a king, and he's basically talking about the parts of this chariot or whatnot. Basically, what is the identity of the chariot? And I think he uses the Greek king's carriage just as it's just more like a character in the story, if you will, than I don't think the king himself is Greek, but I'm not totally sure. I just kind of briefly read an excerpt of this in my Buddhism class, but it's essentially the same kind of thing that was going on with the kind of, so it's basically about the idea of no self, anatta, and also it's connected with the idea of independent origination, that there, so basically what the idea is that there's no independent, unitary, permanent self. And they use this idea of, you know, the 5 aggregates, the 5 skandhas, or in this case, all the different parts of a chariot or a carriage. And basically this dialogue, he just talks with this king, and they go through all these different parts of the chariot, all these different combinations, and say, okay, what really is this chariot? And it comes to the idea that, you know, it's not really any of them. It's a kind of label that is put on something, but its actual identity is not self-enclosed, basically in the same way that a unitary label would be. And it's just something that challenges the idea of a independent, self-enclosed self that corresponds with like something like a name. And the same way it's with people as well. And I think in this case, in the story, I think Borges is using that as an example of something very similar to Hume's arguments against the self too. That basically we have these different impressions, but there's no actual experience of something that unites those in a kind of independent and permanent way. It's basically the mind that connects these things, but there's no real substantial connection, I guess. It's something similar. I think Borges is using this in that sense, that he's saying, you know, the thesis I shall divulge is as ancient as Zeno's arrow or the Greek king's carriage. So I think the way that he's using it in this sense is by just showing once again that basic Humean argument that, you know, we have these disconnected impressions, or these parts, these aggregates. Exactly how do we combine them to give some kind of a permanent identity, whether it's in time or simultaneously as a person, whatnot? That's kind of the whole thing he's questioning, is that kind of interval in between these discontinuous aggregates. Except this time he's applying it more to the idea of time by saying that between these discontinuous moments, we don't have necessarily some self-evident connection. But then, of course, that's exactly what Bergson kind of challenges in saying that there's no discontinuous moment exactly in time. It's a continuity. But I still think there's something, they're talking about 2 different ideas of time that they're kind of questioning. But I think, yeah, Bergson would definitely, I think he has a pretty good answer as to why, you know, why Hume's idea basically could not work for time. And, you know, I could see it working for the idea of identity. I agree with Hume's sort of deconstruction of identity, but I don't think it applies to time, because time is different from the different aspects of your personality, because it's necessarily something that has to be continuous. It has to overlap. It has to interpenetrate with other temporal senses. So that's where I would say the way that he's kind of applying Hume's method to time is not really proper, because of the special qualities that time has as something actually experienced, where that's different from how, say, we experience the notion of ourself. I think it's kind of a faulty analogy in a sense, but at the same time, I kind of see what he's saying, and that if there are these disconnections between moments in time and experiences and whatnot, then exactly how do we know the objective succession of those, the order? We don't. So I can sympathize with that, but yeah, that's my idea.
I think that like you have somebody like Hume who's and this is just all kind of responding to and kind of bouncing off and building off of what Chase said. I think that you have somebody like Hume who's arguing this sort of or at least as far as Borges is sort of employing him, he's arguing against this notion of the sort of unified identity of the self or of the ego or whatever. And I agree with you, Chase, that there's sort of a disconnect between like the I guess formal characteristics of an individual and the temporal context within which that individual exists, or the world within which that individual exists. I mean, they're interrelated, but there is some sort of distance in order to produce that interrelation. I think that Bergson's concept of time as duration brings up some interesting ideas. I think that Bergson very much argues in favor of this, and this is something that I had a problem with Borges with, and I get that we've talked about it already a little bit, but Bergson, I think, theorizes this sort of radical novelty in the moment, in the notion of the present. I think that Bergson is arguing for sort of a radical novelty with each preceding event, and that's not just because I have a memory, let's say, of all the previous events that were similar, or of all the previous events that weren't similar, or whatever. But like, I think that, and this is what I don't really know. I know that Kierkegaard and Freud argue in favor of purely mechanical repetition, and I know Deleuze is all about this, but I don't know how wedded I am to the idea of the existence of purely like absolute repetition of like a thing happening absolutely in a 100% identical way again. You know what I mean? And I think that for me kind of relates to, or comes from, sort of Hegel's idea of Aufheben. When something occurs again, it's brought back in a notional form rather than in a contingent material form, or in its naive sort of form. But I think that now here's where I get kind of, why I started talking, I guess, is because I think that Hume here arguing against this spirit, I think in certain ways, I think that Hume's argument can lend itself towards this sort of towards this Borgesian, I'll call it that, conception of time. It lends itself. I'm not saying that it can guarantee it, or that it even kind of logically moves from one step to the next, but I see where Borges is coming from, and I'm sorry, I might be sounding vague, but I think that Hegel describes, and Gadamer agrees with him, that spirit, this thing that Hume is apparently kind of arguing against or refuting, or did refute, right, is not so much a unified individual, like what is it, an islet of psychism, my psychic island, but is a speculative unity of opposite determinations in concepts, like the bud of a flower and the bloomed flower. Those two are opposites, and they negate each other and they kill each other. But there's a speculative unity between the two, and there's a speculative unity between the time when I went to the graveyard and I felt a feeling, and then I went another time and I felt another feeling. There's a speculative unity that's present, and that speculative unity is spirit in some sense. And that speculative unity only occurs, not, I guess, because, and I think Heidegger really takes this idea and goes crazy with it. I think he goes into a really great direction with like the kind of necessary link that time has with our experience of our ontological position. But I think that Hegel's in this sort of realm with this, transformation between the immediate practical reality and notional forms, and the speculative unity between opposites that as concepts perform this motive act, our experience, this motive sort of dimension of themselves. I think that Hegel's on more of this side that like spirit exists, and that's why things change all the time. Things change all the time, and it's maybe not. And maybe it's not like this clock time. Maybe it's not time per se, but it is a self movement of concepts that occurs upon objects as they are known and as they retain determinations. There's a self movement that occurs within that concept as I relate to it, or as it is related to, and all things are related to, in according to in Hegel's sort of doctrine of known objects. But it's just sort of this position where it's like things are going to change constantly. Things are going to change all the time for everything, even as they're repeated. And I think that Bergson is just taking that idea a bit further and kind of using it in this way to describe like long lines of physical events, like evolution and like society and morality and so on. You know what I mean? And so I don't really know that. And then that was a big problem I had with Borges here that I guess I'm just bringing up here. The big problem that I had while I was reading this essay on time is that like on page 224, he says this piece that I really do like. After Sean, after hearing what you had to say, and like kind of I've been rereading the last like 9 pages of the, and I really have like a sort of greater sort of sense of respect for what's going on here. But on 224, my problems began at the bottom of the first paragraph. He says, starting from the sentence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down, I suspect, however, that the number of circumstantial variants is not infinite. We can postulate in the mind of an individual or of 2 individuals who do not know of each other but in whom the same process works, 2 identical moments. Once this identity is postulated, one may ask, are not these identical moments the same? Is not one single repeated term sufficient to break down and confuse the series of time? Do not the fervent readers who surrender themselves to Shakespeare become literally Shakespeare? And again, like while I agree with the dimension of this, to which it is like a refutation of an objective referent from which to conceive of like consecutive time or whatever, I think that this point that he's bringing up, this I have issue with, in the sense that I don't really know if he kind of explicates sort of a solid argument in favor of pure absolute repetition in this essay. And I don't know, maybe I'm wrong because I wasn't paying attention when he did explicate it. But that was my feeling. And I guess I think Bergson is a good argument against this, and I think Hegel has his own sort of position outside of this question that I'm kind of leaning on. But yeah, that's how I felt about this, and I appreciate what you, Sean, Chase, and Ned, you all helped illuminate that. Thank you.
So my sense of what he said there is again, it's kind of a consequence of that. If you get rid of a metaphysical substance, either in reality or in the self, then there is no principle of no principle of individuation, I guess. And so then if there are any 2 kinds of experiences that actually are identical, then how can you say they're not the same experience? Because you no longer have separate individuals to which those experiences can happen. But I'm kind of with you in the sense that it's hard for me to believe that any 2 experiences are identical. So, but another thing that you made me, or that your comment made me think of is, I remember I mentioned this a while ago, that when Hume says there is no substantial self, or there is no self, then Kant says, well, yet all this phenomena does have structure to it. There must be something that's structuring it. And then Kant says, well, there must be a transcendental ego. And it sounds like what you're saying is that, or that like what you explained was maybe Hegel's answer to that same Humean problem. What structures existence? Well, there's this dialectical thing going on. Because it does seem, and I don't, in this text, Bergson doesn't address, or Borges doesn't address that question. And it seems like it's a good one. If there is just, well, I don't know, maybe he does. I was going to say, if there is no process or anything that is giving structure and coherence, then why do I experience, why does it seem to have some kind of structure? Maybe he would, I don't know. I mean, if it's just a bunch of random moments, I don't know, then whatever it is that is having this experience, why does it experience in this sort of coherent fashion? Or is this just coherence just sort of, this experience of coherence really also not coherence? It's just, I don't, Borges would answer that same question. It seems like Kant has an answer. You've given an answer from Hegel's view. And just as a side note, maybe coherence is, but see, if you say it's a subjective construct, then there has to be a subject to construct it. And it seems like part of what Borges is saying here is that there is no, that Hume did away with the subject. That's why Kant has to reintroduce the subject as the transcendental ego. But as a side note, maybe Borges or Bergson has told us this and I just missed it, but I also don't see where the structuring principle is for Borges, like in duration, what is happening such that duration produces a coherent, apparently temporal structured experience for us. And maybe somewhere in one of his books, this is sort of tied up with the question of what is it to be a self. And I'm not sure, maybe, Bergson hasn't really addressed this in this book. Maybe he does some elsewhere. In other words, I would like to know what Bergson's answer to Hume, to that problem that Hume has is.
All right, so I was busy typing, so I couldn't pay as much attention as I would have liked. But basically, to that, this section that Hunter pointed out, basically that. So he says, I suspect, however, that the number of circumstantial variants is not infinite. We can postulate in the mind of an works two identical moments. I believe he gets that from Will to Power, Nietzsche's notebooks, where he wrote, so he was playing around with different ideas. This is just his notebooks about different cosmological proofs, possible proofs for eternal recurrence. And that was basically one of them. Basically, if there are, finite variants in the universe, and there's only so many, then after a certain amount of time, given enough time, you'll have the same combination of these finite variants again. So that whatever variant, whatever, combination of variants you can think of will continuously repeat, given enough time. Of course, they won't repeat in the same order necessarily, but they will, the same moment, I guess, will repeat in some fashion. But yeah, I think Nietzsche did not choose to publish this idea for a reason, because I think there's problems with it. Mainly that, there's a whole lot more going on in a moment than what is kind of self-enclosed as a, what you can think of as different atoms of experience or whatnot. Those are all kind of, kind of theoretical ways of thinking about experience, more so than, I think the experience itself is always going to have some kind of a context to go with it that makes it where it's not identical. Because even if you have the same seemingly identical experience, well, the second time you have it, it has the meaning behind it, the significance of it, that's the second time I've had this experience. Therefore, it's somewhat different in that respect. And that's giving a lot of saying that, the experience itself, given that it's the same in terms of the perceptual experience or something like that, there's still going to be differences in some other way. So that's where I think there's definitely problems with that sense. I can't remember what I was going to say, so I'll just leave it there.
So thinking about that a little bit, because one thing that I'm worried about that is it's a kind of circular reasoning, right? Because if we're saying like, well, there have to be differences between these two instances, but if one of the main ways that we're sort of determining the existence of those differences is we're postulating that there's something like time that explains the difference. So for instance, like, I don't know, I'm observing two electrons and they appear to do the same thing twice. Well, I might assert that, well, the difference between the first observation and the second observation is that the first observation was the first one and the second observation was the second one. But then, like, if it seems as though I'm assuming time when I do that, right? Like, I'm assuming that these things are happening in a temporal order, which is the very thing that I'm trying to establish. And thinking about, so Deleuze got referenced, and I'm kind of thinking about how he would respond to this. And part of what he's doing, right, is just starting metaphysically with the assumption of difference and then moving forward with that. So, I might end up postulating, right, theoretically, something like time in order to account for this difference that I'm observing. But the existence of a difference is the metaphysically primary thing, and the description that I provide of what that difference is ultimately the thing that I'm building in order to talk about it. And like, to that extent, like, I think the thing that got mentioned earlier was like a kind of speculative conception of temporality. I think as soon as you're willing to have a speculative philosophy in the vein of, like, I don't know, Whitehead, or Deleuze, or probably arguably Hegel, right, or Heidegger, a bunch of, we could mention a lot of philosophers who are arguably willing to be speculative and rather than kind of concrete in the way that Plato might be, then it seems to just totally get around right, these Berkeleyan, Humean, Borgesian problems, right? Because as long as we're saying, like, look, I observe a thing that kind of looks like time, and I'm going to build an account of that, but I'm going to be willing to revise that account if I find compounds or conflicts or other possible interpretations that might be in my interpretation. Then, like, all of this argumentation about, well, look, there isn't any way that you can have a concrete idea of what time is, just goes out the window, because I'm not looking for that. I'm just looking for an explanation of this experience that I'm having, and I'm calling whatever that explanation is time. But right, that time isn't a concrete thing in that model. It's just the word I'm using to describe whatever model I currently have of this specific experience. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I don't know, I was just thinking about, like, my conception of like those two memories or those two events being different because they happened at different points. From my conception, that's not necessarily time that does that, but memory. And so the question that I would want to ask is what I put in the chat, which I don't really feel like I have an answer to. But yeah, like if can we remember things without a conception of time? You know, can there still be this kind of like if there was no time, we still have some level of repetition. You know, there is still some kind of element of this thing happening more than once. And so could you still remember an event without having a conception of time to kind of back it up as it happening in the past? Which I don't know. That's just.
Yeah, I think the point I was trying to make, which I think it was poorly worded, because I'm just kind of coming up with these ideas off the top of my head. But basically it'd be that, you know, okay, Borges goes and he remembers, I may have this totally wrong, actually, not thinking about it, but doesn't he, so he has this experience in his childhood of standing at that corner or whatever, and then he goes back as an adult and just kind of, you know, just roaming around, and then stumbles upon the same spot, and then says that they're the same experience, essentially. Is that correct? Did I get that right?
He does seem to accept that, like, the experience is sort of compounded by the fact that he has the prior memory. I found that, like, I found that example to be really helpful to think about what he was talking about, but he doesn't seem to do a good job of making the concrete claim you just mentioned, that like they were definitely identical experiences.
Yeah, because that's where I think, you know, to go to what Travis was saying about memory, and, you know, by him being able to say that these two different experiences are actually really the same experience, and that therefore this, you know, is a whole in the idea of an objective succession of things, because things can repeat. I think the problem is that argument has to presuppose an idea of sequence in some manner, and also of time working in the sense of memory, of recalling, and being able to differentiate in memory between the different experiences, in order to say that, how does he know that they're actually that they're two experiences of the same thing? In order to say that, I think he has to have some kind of notion of maybe not succession, but at least like some kind of sequence where he can differentiate them in order for them to say that the two things are actually the same. That there's some kind of presupposition of what he's trying to disprove, I believe. Although I can definitely see, Sean, what you're saying about, by saying that that these two are actually different, then that would be presupposing time then, which I think that's pretty much true, but in a way it's because I'm more trying to disprove that those two moments can be identical because that there's time, necessarily then I'm trying to prove that there is time, if that makes sense. Hopefully it does.
So
Trying to prove time.
Something like that.
So I'm looking at that passage. I think it's on page 226, which is Ed. It's right. It's a few paragraphs before the letter B section. And you know, it's at the bottom of that page, which is the second paragraph before B, where he says these are the same experience. it's not merely identical to the one present on that corner so many years ago. It is, without resemblance or repetitions, the very same. But then if you look at the end of the previous paragraph, when he describes the experience, he says, I felt dead. I felt as an abstract spectator of the world, an indefinite fear imbued with science. I don't know what that means, which is the best clarity of metaphysics. I did not think that I had returned upstream or on the supposed waters of time. Rather, I suspected that I was possessor of a reticent or absent sense of the inconceivable world eternity. Only later was I able to identify that imagination. And, you know, so this is hubris for me to say this, or some other bad word, but, you know, he seems to have had some kind of profound experience when he went back, and he has this experience that seems to be one of sort of stepping outside of time, the sort of transcendence of time. And I'm wondering if then what he says in the next paragraph is then his sort of after the fact interpretation of that event. That's why I say this is a little, I mean, it's you know, who am I to say what he experienced and whether it was interpretation or not? But that's what he had experience disjointed from time. And this kind of, I don't know if you've had these kinds of experiences where you have this kind of shock, and at least for the moment, the world seems very different from what you have normally experienced. And so it seems like maybe he has some kind of experience like this. And then later upon reflection, he says, well, this clearly was the same experience. Well, I don't know. I'm wondering if the inference he makes at that last paragraph on the page, it's kind of like in Zen, you know, when you have these certain meditative experiences, and at least more traditional Zen practitioners will actually warn people away from drawing metaphysical conclusions from those kinds of experiences. You know, they say let them stand as experiences as part of your practice. But then, of course, you have whole schools of Zen philosophy like the Kyoto school, who that's exactly what they do. They draw metaphysical implications from those experiences. And so I kind of wonder, you know, maybe that's part of what's happening here, because it does seem to be not merely speculation. It seems to have been kind of a profound experience that he had there.
Nevitt, do you remember? I don't remember if it was William James or William James's father who had an experience when he was in the farm, and there was something like an injury, but it had, for lack of a better term, metaphysical significance, and that seemed to be very important to the whole family, and especially with William James's, you know, philosophical bent, and then Henry going off in the world of fiction. But it seemed like an experience that certainly had physical attributes, but that was very difficult to put into words, and yet at the same time I wouldn't necessarily call it spiritual or religious, but it seemed to have of James getting a sense that he understood something about the universe fundamentally that he hadn't understood before.
Yeah. So I don't remember that, but I'm wondering if this may be something, you know, maybe something similar. And then when you go and put it in words, you know, it doesn't quite get there. And so, you know, maybe something like that's going on here. Is he has these theoretical explorations, and then he has this kind of experience, and then maybe, like you said, then when he tries to put that experience into words and express it, then this is the way it seems to him. But I don't know. Like I said, that, you know, it's, who am I to tell Borges, no, you misinterpreted that experience. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's part of the problem with trying to make arguments from experience. It's such a personal, private thing that you basically, okay, the only thing I can really do is basically take your word for it. You know, that's not really going to work for a philosophical argument. It's just interesting from a kind of a literary perspective, but I think from a philosophical perspective, it would be the experience can maybe give you certain insights, and then from there, maybe you can build some kind of a way of explaining it that doesn't just refer to some kind of a special private experience. I've had those moments too before where you realize something and it seems so ineffable, but then philosophically I can't just refer to that and be like, you should have just been there. I basically try to think of a way of putting it into the language of philosophy so that I can communicate it as a concept. And it's really, I mean, it's pretty similar to what Bergson is talking about, you know, with this interplay between intuition and dialectic. It's something kind of like that. And I can definitely see where Borges is going in the sense of that he has some kind of extraordinary experience that gives him these ideas. But I think also, like Nev was saying, there's about Zen and whatnot, there's definitely a danger in, you know, how exactly do you translate that experience into some kind of conceptual idea? You know, there's not going to be some kind of a perfect way to do that. And I think that's where you definitely want to have some kind of a critical, skeptical stance towards your own ability to really draw the metaphysical conclusions from that experience. And that's part of the difficulty of it. And I think, well, that's another thing that philosophy can sort of help is by trying to be critical of those experiences while at the same time trying to give us a language so that we can describe them and explain them in some way, more than just a way that kind of appeals to something that we can never know or never really communicate. I think maybe philosophy in the way of, you know, being able to have something like a common vocabulary to describe something, it can at least give us some way of trying to break out of just the purely private, subjective nature of some kind of an extraordinary experience that gives you some kind of insight. But I think a lot of people, their ideas that they have, their ultimate, you know, hardcore beliefs, they're ultimately going to come. Most people do not get those ideas, those core ideas that really guide them from, you know, some kind of well thought out reasoning. They didn't, you know, put propositional symbolic logic on paper and deduce, you know, that God doesn't exist or does exist, you know. Anselm's arguments, you know, the ontological argument probably never actually converted anyone in the history of the world. Otherwise, I wouldn't want to meet the person who is actually convinced by the ontological argument to believe in God. This seems absurd to me. But so I think there's really more of those experiences and intuitions and these flashes of insight and whatnot that really give us those ideas. And then afterwards, in order to try to communicate those things, then that's where, you know, dialectic and reasoning and logic, then that can help by trying to, you know, really come to some kind of focus on exactly what is really being communicated there, what we're really saying, what does our experience really do to provide us some kind of insight or not, or what exactly is going on there. So I think Borges here, though, I think it's interesting that he shared his experience, but at the same time, I think possibly the way that he's, you know, framing this in a kind of, you know, it's kind of a post ironic meta thing that he's framing it in. I think probably by the fact that he's kind of giving these arguments, where he's having to rely on these experiences that are, we can't experience it the same way he did, so we don't know. That's also kind of why he's framing it in this way of, don't take it super seriously, but at the same time, he's definitely not saying that, this is all complete bullshit or whatever. There's something going on, but it's just like, yeah, just don't take it too seriously, I think is kind of what he's saying. And a part of that is because, he's making an argument based off of experience to some degree. And yeah, it's never going to be completely satisfactory.
Like life.
Indeed.
Yep.
I think Borges would agree with that.
Yep. Any final comments? Almost a quarter after. Well, thank you. So I think we've got one more meeting and we'll finish the book, which are what he calls parables. And I sent out a query about possible scheduling times for the philosophy. Folks are working on the later seminar, and Alex asks the question: Have you guys decided on a book for sure?
Oh yeah, let's we can discuss that now. So I think we're thinking about doing the two SUNY versions, but
That's for the
Chilling.
yeah, exactly, yeah.
I think they're asking about the lit.
Oh, so for the lit one, there hasn't been any kind of official decision yet. So I think we need to figure. Well, maybe we can. Travis and Hunter already left. I think we're leaning towards Kafka. At least they were, and I think that's probably going to be the selection, but it has not officially been decided because basically we haven't actually gotten everyone together who says they're going to participate in order to actually make the decision. So that's just basically speculation at that point.
Well, did you all? I remember Kafka being mentioned maybe 2 weeks ago. What was there any, even if it was speculative, was it which one of his novels or how many of his novels would be used? I mean, was it the trial? Was it the metamorphosis?
Yeah, it was. It's the, where is it? It's called The Essential Kafka by Wordsworth.
Oh, okay.
And I got it from Amazon for $5, which I thought part of the appeal was that it was very cheap, and it has the trial, the castle, and some of his shorter stories like the Metamorphosis in it.
Okay.
So it's not his complete works or anything, but it's a pretty substantial amount. I think it's like 600 pages or so.
Wow.
Oh, well, that's a lot.
Yeah, I'm thinking at least it's not. So Gravity's Rainbow, I think, is 700, and that one's supposed to be a lot more dense, where I think Kafka isn't quite as dense. So that's the only reason I'd be okay with reading this.
Yeah, Gravity's Rainbow is very, very long, and you're right, it's dense. And the advantage of Kafka is, even though I'm not saying the trial is a load of laughs, each of the ones you mentioned are shorter. So, there could be a sense of three works, three major works being read over the course of a semester, and a sense of, a greater sense of Kafka.
Yeah.
But I don't have a strong opinion because I'm not going to know until, when do you have to pull the trigger? Because I won't know if I have an opponent for my re-election campaign until August 17th, August 18th. And if I don't have an opponent, life is a wonderful and bright and transcendent place. But if I do have an opponent, that's just going to be a lot of work, even if I can't go door to door because of the virus.
Yeah, I think so. I'll message them today and try to get that figured out, because I'd rather have it settled sooner rather than later.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Yeah, and then I think the thing with the philosophy one, though, I think we need to make a decision for that one too pretty soon, just based off the fact that if the philosophy department is going to buy at least some of the books, I think they need to do it soon so that we would actually get them in time. Or I'm not even sure exactly how that would work at all necessarily.
I can get to the Schilling seminar, and I'm fine with the 2 books you all mentioned. I defer to you all 100%. I just, when it comes to the Kafka one, and I wanted, again, that it's like a double deference there, because I don't know if I can be a part of it, so I don't even want to express a preference over Gravity's Rainbow or Kafka. But if you could just let me know whenever that decision is made, and then, whatever your decision is, I'll and I can be a part of it, I will. But I definitely want to make sure I'm getting the right Schilling text, and not only the right text, but the right edition or the publisher, because it's just, and something like a philosophical text, it makes so much difference to actually literally be on the same, I'm not punning here, I'm not trying to, but literally on the same page. So when someone says page 53, it's like, okay, that's my page 53. And especially since we're Zooming it just makes the conversation easier.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think we need to have the same version, although I was getting kind of worried about it because I looked at the prices for them yesterday, and they're all like I think the first one is something like $27, and then the second one is $31, and I'm not sure that the philosophy department, Dr. Hanks, will be willing to.
Yeah, I that's one reason I'd like to get a sense of the books, is so I can ask him about that, because he did express, I sent him that question, and he said, yes, I would like the department to purchase the books. My worry, which he did not express, but is that since there's 2 of them and they're relatively expensive, would he be willing to do that, especially since I'm going to be opening that seminar up to anybody who wants to join. But I think I will send him a query about that, because I think 2 of the versions of the Schelling books were, when I was looking, I think this is the publisher's list price. Like 2 of them were 24 and 2 of them were 33 or something like that. And that's not the Amazon price, that's the publisher's list price. But so 2 of those for a whole bunch of people would be pretty expensive. So I'm guessing at the very least he would be willing to purchase 1 of them, perhaps. But if the fiction text, so he also, from what I remember on the email message, he's interested in purchasing the fiction text as well, and if that one is on the order of $5, that might help. He might be a little more happy about paying more for the philosophy text, so that would be another vote for Kafka. But I'm kind of like Ed. Since I'm not sure whether I can participate or how much I can participate in the fiction, I don't want my preferences to be much of the calculation. Having said that, an advantage for me for Kafka would be, since the selections are shorter than an entire novel, be more likely that I could participate, because maybe I could come in here and there based on what you're reading this time or that time. But again, like Ed, I think you should put my preferences low on your list of concerns. So anyway.
Yeah, I think. Did I just cut someone off?
No, I was laughing at something Alex said.
Oh, okay, sorry. So, I mean, I think that it would be easier for you to do Kafka is also another reason why I favor that one, because trying to just hop in with Gravity's Rainbow, I think that's going to be just too much. But at the same time, I'm willing to read either one. But I think we probably just need to set up some kind of like a voting system, and just so we can just get this thing decided and try and figure it out.
Well,
Yeah.
I've been using Google Forms to set up these voting. I guess, Chase, since I don't think you've, I don't know, maybe the first seminar, the one on that we did on Hesse, maybe you saw that there, but since then I haven't been using them because we've been choosing them without the voting. But I've been using Google Forms to they have a lot of options for doing multiple choice and all that stuff. That's not a bad way to. I mean, if if you guys are not comfortable doing that, if you want to send me the options and then, or just tell me what the options are, I could, set that up pretty easily. And then just like I did with the time preference, just send a link to everybody to the form and then people can vote. So anyway, you guys can send me an email message or something if you want me to do that or anything like that.
Okay, yeah, I think I can definitely set that up. And let's see, for the literature one, I think we should be able to do it between me, Travis, and Hunter, and set that up. I think for the philosophy one, though, I could possibly just make it, and because the options are so complex, it's difficult to keep a track of. But
well, I don't mind. I mean, I'm considering myself the administrator for the philosophy one, so I'm assuming I will do all the work there. I guess maybe we should vote. I was just assuming that we had kind of settled on the SUNY editions, especially if Craig can pay for them. But
I guess the question would be, do we want to get both or one, and then if only one, then which one, right? But maybe it would make sense to ask Craig first, because if they can just buy us both and get enough to distribute to everyone who wants, then it's like, oh, well, if we've all pretty much agreed that that's what we want to do, then that's perfect. If it has to be one or the other, then maybe it would make sense to do a poll after that to see which people prefer, if they want to, or if we want to, shell out of pocket to buy whichever one the department isn't willing to buy for us, right? We could put that up as part of the poll as well, if we wanted to do it that way. But part of the problem with the literature one is that, like, other than it sounds like we have like two choices so far, which, I mean, I guess that's fine. You can set up a poll with just the two choices, but I guess it would be. Yeah, I actually never mind. I withdraw what I was saying there. We can just set up a poll with two choices.
Yeah, I think technically there's four, but realistically, it's really between those two. I mean, it looks like Kafka's probably going to win, though. So it's basically a poll with just like one option, but it's just like make sure that indeed I'm not just assuming that Kafka's going to win automatically, because it seems to me like it's going to win. It's basically just to have something objective to actually show that is actually the one that people want to read.
So, I sent out an email message here, I don't know, a week or two ago, where I said, we seem to have settled on these Sunni editions, but that if anybody has an objection, now would be the time to express that. You could do something like that. You could say, there's been some discussion between these two books. There seems to be a preference for the Kafka. Would anybody like to, state why they would prefer to read this other one? And hopefully do it. Go back to the whole list rather than just to you. So there could be kind of a public discussion on email about it. I mean, since it's just those two, you wouldn't even have to have a form. You could just say, we're thinking of, here's the discussion about these two books. People seem to have this preference. Would anybody does anyone have a strong preference otherwise? Something like that.
Yeah, I'm thinking, so you sent that email that basically said that about the two Sunni editions.
Right.
I think that should basically work, but then there's still the complications with whether there'll be funding to get it, whether they'll buy it first or not. But
so here's what I'm thinking. I think Sean's probably right. So maybe, Chase, have you guys decided whether you want to invite more people than the core group, whether you want, and again, I don't have any particular preferences there. It's kind of up to you. If you want to invite undergrads and grads, or whether you want to just have it be this group plus whoever you guys invite.
Yeah, I would like to, oh, whoops. Sorry, my phone's kind of cutting out, but I would like to have the philosophy majors invited personally.
So what I'm thinking, since Sean said the cost is, or whether the department will pay is probably going to be an issue, I will write an email message to Craig and say, here's the books we're considering. Here's the people that I'm pretty certain are going to want to join, this core group. And then, but if we broadcast it out to the whole department, who knows how many people will join. So I'll write him an email like that and just ask him, how do you feel about paying for this? Does it depend on how high the bill gets, or do you want to just commit to buying one of these Schelling books and not the other one? So I'll send him an email message out in the next day or two, and hopefully get a response. So just on a side note, Sean, your experience with emails from Craig, it's nothing about you. That like on the faculty evaluations for Craig, most people are like, wow, this guy is the greatest. We love this guy. He's a wonderful child, but damn it, he never answers his email messages. So
we are still recording.
Oh!
I can probably cut this last part out.
I'm sure Hanks knows that this is.
Oh, he knows.
Yeah, I
He
think
knows
so.
he doesn't answer emails. It won't be a surprise to him.
No, he knows. I mean, he's admitted as such. Like he'll say in faculty meetings, yeah, I know I've got this problem. I need to work on it. But what I do is, and I probably shouldn't record this, but whatever. What I'll do is sometimes I'll go poke Camry and say, hey, Camry, can you bug? Well, maybe that probably doesn't work as much, because then she would just literally walk over to his office and kind of poke at him. But I don't think they're in the building at the same time anymore. So, but anyway, I'll send him an email message and hopefully he'll respond, and then that will give us a better idea of, like Sean was saying, which kind of way we want to lean.
Yeah, so that was actually another thing I was wondering about, is if the office isn't open, then how would we get the books if they bought them?
So the office is going to open, I'm not sure when, but starting the first day of classes is August 24th. That's the Monday. Now, whether they're going to be there the previous week, I don't know. But starting at least by the 24th, I think the full office is going to be there. They're just all going to be wearing masks all the time. And so since there's going to be some classes that are all in person and some classes that are part in person and part online, I think they're planning on having a full office complement. So, you know, I'm thinking that won't be a problem, at least for people who can drop by the office and pick up the book. And so far, Camry has had no problem about mailing a book to books to Alex. So I assume that would all continue to not be a problem.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay, so I'll send that email out and I'll let you know what I hear from Craig. Any other points of discussion?
I think that's finally it. I think we're done.
Okay. Well, thank you guys. Don't
All
use
right.
my words for blackmail purposes, please. And
Never.
No promises.
He's looking for a job. He's not going to remove any
That's true.
asset that he has.
Not going to bring any.
Everything goes in a big folder and it's there. And if I need it, I need it. And if I don't, it's fine.
That's right. Okay. If I treat you well. Okay. We'll see you guys. Bye-bye.
See you later.
Bye.